I'd like to congratulate Vice President Kamala Harris on her victory in the presidential debate last night against, checks notes, BRET BAIER'S. Despite the refusal by the moderator to stop her opponent from compulsively interrupting her, the moderator, checks notes again, BRET BAIER'S. And despite the fact that when she called out Trump for threatening to use the military against citizens and jailing those who criticize him, and about the enemy within, the anchor claimed to be playing a clip of Trump pertaining to that, only they did a bait and switch. The anchor played a Trump clip about a different topic. The anchor, checks notes a third time, BRET BAIER'S.
Question to the former president today. Harris Faulkner had a town hall, and this is how he responded.
I heard about that. They were saying I was like threatening. I'm not threatening anybody. They're the ones doing the threatening. They do phony investigations. I've been investigated more than Alphonse Capone. He was the greatest gangster. No, it's true. No, but think of it. It's called weaponization of government. It's a terrible thing.
So,
Brett, I'm sorry, and with all due respect, that clip was not what he has been saying about the enemy within that he has repeated when he's speaking about the American people. That's not what you just showed.
Well, he was asked about that specific...
No, that's not what you just showed. In all fairness and respect to you...
That was the question that we asked him.
You didn't show that, and here's the bottom line. He has repeated it many times, and you and I both know that. And you and I both know that he has talked about turning the American military on the American people. He has talked about going after people who are engaged in peaceful protest. He has talked about locking people up because they disagree with him. This is a democracy. And in a democracy, the President of the United States, in the United States of America, should be willing to be able to handle criticism without saying he'd lock people up for doing it. And this is what is at stake, which is why you have someone like the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying what Mark Milley has said about Donald Trump being a threat to the United States of America.
He's quoted in the Bob Woodward book that way, yes. Let me ask you this, Madam Vice President. You call Donald Trump...
the significance of that.
She kicked Baier's ass. She went on Fox, and despite being subjected to a failed gotcha and conspiracy theory interview that could have been prepared by Catturd or another one of those neurotic paranoids on the right, like Trump, she answered his questions and called Fox out on its lies on Fox. Although I give Baier credit, he has apparently not resigned, nor realized that until last night he had not actually been out in the real world, talking to people who weren't sycophantic towards him and his propaganda channel, and the poisonous bastard who owns it, Rupert Murdoch, hadn't been out in the real world since he was a local newscaster in Charlotte in 1998. He hasn't quit the business nor fled the country. Well done. At the other extreme, Trump yesterday went on a Fox Women's Town Hall with actual Republican Party officials among the questioners. They didn't reveal that. And when he was still asked by somebody why the government had any authority over a woman's body, he answered by lying again that everybody wanted Roe v. Wade overturned. And then he went on Univision and did a town hall with questions from the people he is the most prejudiced against. And boy, is that saying something. Hispanics. And one man asking one question in Spanish about this bullshit about the legal immigrants in Ohio eating pets. That resulted in Trump denying that he had ever said that was happening. He was just repeating reports. The central dehumanizing and degrading theme of his and Vance's campaign of hate and violence and nightmare, and Trump disavowed it completely.
Do you really believe that these people are eating the people's pets?
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And this was just reported. I was just saying what was reported. That's been reported. And eating other things, too, that they're not supposed to be. But this is, all I do is report. I was there, I'm going to be there, and we're going to take a look, and I'll give you a full report when I do. But that's been in the newspapers and reported pretty broadly.
Via con Dios, Donnie, your meat. And just to round out the set, Tim Walz did some more Tim Waltzing yesterday, which is why his approval numbers are within 1 point of where they were right after the vice presidential debate. But J.V. Vance did some more J.V. Vancing yesterday, which is why his approval numbers were -2 right after the debate, but are now -10. Vance was again asked about his repeated, endless, nauseating tiptoeing around the question of whether or not he believes Trump lost in 2020, and he finally answered it, and the answer was, not great. Not great, JV.
On the election of 2020, I've answered this question directly a million times. No. I think there are serious problems in 2020. So did Donald Trump lose the election? Not by the words that I would use.
So it's Harris, fresh off a victory over Fox News, on Fox News, and over Trump by proxy on Fox News, versus Trump of the famous Trump pre-recorded concert series and his running mate, a lunatic election denier wearing eyeliner. But back for a moment to Baier and the vice president. Throughout the interview, I kept flashing back to 36 years ago. May have been this month. I was trying too hard in a brand new job at Channel 2 in Los Angeles. I did an absolutely terrible, long satirical segment about a top draft choice who was in the middle of a contract holdout from a local sports team. And then I ran it again and only shortened it a little bit. And it was terrible. Not funny, not clever, not worth it. Bill Stout was one of my friends and role models at KCBS TV. He had been on the air doing news in L.A. at that point for 39 years. And he was still in the office every day, though he was desperately ill, and he would die still on the job almost exactly a year later. Bill had been involved in my hiring. He was very supportive. And as I walked back to my desk after the disaster of the Danny Manning satire, he looked at me and said, I know. Look at it this way. You have far more courage than I do, my boy. If I had just put that on the air, I'd have gone home and nobody would have ever seen me on TV again. And I laughed and I thanked him and I said, next time tell me beforehand. And he agreed. In that spirit, Bret Baier, next time you're going to try to bully and talk over and play gotcha with and smear the Vice President of the United States and the likely next President of the United States, my advice to you is, first, quit your job and go right to a monastery to atone. I say the likely next president for a reason. As the Harris interview aired on Fox News, Fox put out its new polling. Last month, Fox had Harris up by 2, 50-48. Now, it has Trump ahead by 2, 50-48, a 4-point swing. However, Fox's polling, registered voters, shows Harris ahead in the battleground states by 6 points. 6 points in the battlegrounds. That's all they say. Surprisingly enough, they did not break this down state by state, nor after the initial mention in a very long story full of very pretty graphs, did they ever circle back to the point that she's winning in the battleground states according to their polling by 6 points. They made only one further point way at the end, namely that if their current polling is correct, Trump would win the popular vote, but Harris would win the Electoral College. I don't know about you, but if Trump wins the popular vote and Harris wins the Electoral College, I would be laughing so long that they would have to tape my mouth shut during her inauguration address. Also on polling, YouGov for The Economist. Polling concluded Tuesday. Harris 49, Trump 45. Harris by 4. But more importantly, last week in this poll among Hispanic voters, YouGov for The Economist, it was Harris 48, Trump 43. This week in The Economist poll among Hispanic voters, Harris 60, Trump 35. That is a swing in Hispanic voters of 20 points to Harris in 1 week. Economist average of polls, Harris 49.8, Trump 46.7, Harris by 3 and change and almost at 50%. Also Fairleigh Dickinson University poll, Harris 50, Trump 47, and two other polls to mention as analyzed by the former top Republican strategist Matt Dowd. He notes the most accurate national poll from 2020, TIP. It had Biden up by 4, and Biden won the popular vote by 4.5. Now has Harris up by 3. He notes that the most accurate poll from 2016, Marist, had Clinton up by 2 in the popular vote. Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1%. Marist, has Harris up by 5. He concludes, very simply, this race has been very stable for 6 weeks. For once, the actual numbers, even the ones Dowd does not cite, mean something. In that Marist poll, she is up by 5. She's up 52 to 47. In that TIP poll he mentions, it's Harris 50 to 46. I mentioned Fairleigh Dickinson. In that one, it's Harris 50, Trump 47. That is 3 prominent polls where she is at 50% or more. We don't know what the number is in the swing states in the Fox poll, but if she's winning by 6, she may be at 50 in the swing states in the Fox poll. The 538 average of polls has her up by 2.6. That is her biggest margin in 8 days. This crap turns on a dime. The swing states in other polling still nauseatingly tight, no matter what Fox says that's so beneficial to Kamala Harris. But there is unquestionably a polling surge going on right now, and as of this moment, it is towards Kamala Harris. Not that you would know that from the news outlets. It continues. The lead at Politico yesterday, Harris and Trump exit their comfort zones. Quoting, after sticking mostly, though not entirely, with more liberal-friendly shows and podcasts, 60 Minutes is a liberal-friendly show? Univision Town Hall? Idiots. She'll be in for a drastic change on Fox. Pete Buttigieg aside, party leaders rarely appear on the network because they think the risk isn't worth the reward, even absent the head of a neck-and-neck presidential race. She kicked their ass. How does Politico think Trump exited his comfort zone, by the way? By being interviewed at the Economic Club at Chicago. Politico, have you had a wellness check lately? Has this whole Liza thing really destroyed the place? I find that hard to believe. When self-proclaimed super businessman Trump sits down to talk business at an economic club with a business publication, Bloomberg, whose Twitter handle is @business, and he takes business questions from the business editor, he did not just leave his business comfort business zone. Harris kicked BRET BAIER'S ass. Trump crashed and burned in front of an audience full of businessmen. Also of interest here, there's still more newsy news. There's so much revenge popcorn, it has caused the lining of my stomach to burst in some places. And it's cold revenge popcorn, too. And if that is not nightmare fuel for you, maybe this will be. How about CNN being sold to Elon Musk? That's next. Ted didn't like it. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Still ahead on this edition of Countdown, so the New York Post attacked me yesterday because I made a joke. A crass joke. The crass joke consisted of one word and an emoji, and it wasn't crass. You may not have thought it was funny, but it wasn't crass. The Post tweeted about the Ryan Lizza reply to my ex's legal filing for what amounts to a restraining order against her ex, with him saying she told him RFK Jr.'s plan for Liv was to impregnate and possess. I added, same, with the shrug emoji. Now, it might not be funny, but to deconstruct the effort, phrasing it that way, I could have meant same, as in that was also my plan for her, or same, that it was RFK's plan for me. Anyway, you decide if it's funny. I think it was. But they wrote an entire article about this, incredibly crass, because they were punishing me. When the New York Post attacks someone, if that person fights back, the rule there is, and I have been told this by people who work and worked there, they have to attack harder. You're supposed to accept the Post's punishment and shut up. This is Murdoch, and Murdoch runs his operation like the mafia runs their operation. Anyway, I don't do that. They were about to report, if you'll remember, that Olivia and I had dated, so I beat them to it. Rupert mad. Rupert mad. So this was my punishment yesterday. They make up a story. They've been doing this, fake scandals, followed by reactions to fake scandals, if I thwart them. They've been doing this since 1996. To me, they've been doing it to everybody since Murdoch bought the paper. The process coming up and examples of it in things I promised not to tell. First, there's still more new idiots to talk about, the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The bronze. Worse. Okay, why not? We're here anyway. Newsy, Ryan Lizza, and RFK Jr. Again, I don't know what day of this is, but seriously, they are now in the Washington Post. And clearly, somebody gave the Washington Post the entirety of my ex's self-defense filing to the court, because this is new, and quoting the paper, quoting this filing by Ryan Lizza. In a document filed with the court Friday and made public Tuesday, Lizza said Newsy's allegations were, quote, defamatory lies that were meant to create sensational headlines, damage my reputation, and distract from press attention about Ms. Newsy's catastrophically reckless behavior, unquote. Uh-oh. Catastrophically reckless behavior, you say? Yeah, that's her. I'd recognize her anywhere. All right, so this might change again, but right now I'm leaning towards Lizza being less wrong than Newsy. And by the way, Lizza, Newsy, can we somehow work Lizzo into this story? Also, there's this from the WAPO. Quoting the paper, during Tuesday's virtual court hearing, Newsy's video showed her in a tastefully decorated room wearing a black crew neck shirt with her hair loose. She kept a straight face throughout the attorney's negotiations. Lizza appeared seated with his attorneys in a blue sweater with a gray jacket. He looked disappointed when the judge decided that the trial would be postponed until November. Two things. Once again, the Washington Post cannot look at Donald Trump with makeup on his face where he's missed a whole spot near his ear and say he put on his makeup badly today, or whoever put it on for him did it badly today. They can't say that. They can't listen to him being insane every day of the week for the last 9 years at least and say the man is insane. They can't publish a story, although they came closest to it, describing what happened in Pennsylvania on Monday night, what happened in Oaks, Pennsylvania, when he went into that fugue state and just decided to play all the hits. They can't do that, but they can say that Ryan Lizza looked disappointed when the judge decided to do it. Did he say something, or you just saw the smirk on his face change slightly? You're basing the phrase, he looked disappointed, which is now in the Washington Post, as fact, based on a reporter interpreting what they saw. Why don't you do that with Trump? Why don't you all do that with Trump? Interpret what you saw. That's why you're there. Otherwise, they could just send the tape recorder and a guy who presses the button and then goes. Second aside, with the popcorn I have already consumed during this story, I have regained 10 of the 45 pounds I had lost. Thanks a lot, kids. The runner-up worser, James Dolan, the owner of the New York Knicks, New York Rangers, and the home of the only most famous arena in the world that he is now responsible for having rented out to Nazis in 2 consecutive centuries, Madison Square Nazi Garden. Dolan's name has popped up again where trash like him should probably try to avoid it. First, it was renting the garden to Trump for a fascist rally and fundraiser 8 days before the election. It'll be like when the elephants used to come in for the circus during the playoffs, the Stanley Cup playoffs, and you'd go to a Rangers playoff game, which had to be rescheduled because the elephants had been taking huge dumps on top of the garden over the ice. And all you could do was go get a shovel, as I once said in radio in college. Yeah, elephant crap and Trump. That's about the same. Now, in any event, the Legal Defense Fund for New York's possibly doing this deliberately as some sort of prank for a TV series or something, mayor, Eric Adams. Eric Adams, who has an approval rating of not, and whose city leadership divides evenly now into his appointees who have resigned, some under indictment, and his appointees who have not yet resigned. Dolan has given the Eric Adams Legal Defense Fund $5,000, and another Dolan at the same address named Aiden, who appears to be his son, has given another $5,000. So you have James Dolan on the one hand tied to the disastrous messianic mayor of New York, and on the other tied to the disastrous psychotic presidential candidate of the Republican Nazi Party. Let's go, Rangers! But our winners, David Zaslav and Elon Musk. David Zaslav, Warner Bros. Discovery chieftain, the man who has run CNN into the ground to the point where Lachlan Cartwright has reported now that they couldn't afford raises for all their, quote, stars, unquote. The best anybody's getting is the same they're already being paid in new contracts, and they may let Chris Wallace go. You know how old Chris Wallace is? He's 206. What's more, though, Oliver Darcy reports in his newsletter that David Zaslav is courting Elon Musk. Yes, Daddy Warbucks himself, Elon Musk. As Darcy notes in his newsletter Status, in March, Muskie wrote, "As mind-blowingly tragic as this sounds, some poor suckers still believe CNN." Yet, Darcy scoops that when Musk and Zaslav were seen on the telecast of tennis's U.S. Open last month, sitting next to each other, it was actually just part 2. Again, quoting Darcy, earlier in the summer, Zaslav had hosted Musk at his oceanside estate off Lily Pond Lane in East Hampton. People familiar with the matter told me. Musk was traveling in the Hamptons for a Michael Milken event, and Zaslav urged him to drop by. Regardless, Zaslav's relationship with Musk extends beyond the occasional meetup. When not spending time together in person, the two have been regularly exchanging... Oh, for a second, I thought it was FaceTime and Newsy and Liza again and RFK Jr. Oh, thank God. Have been regularly exchanging text messages. One of the people familiar with their relationship told me. They have a relationship? What kind of a relationship? No, don't tell me. Oliver Darcy seems to think courting Musk is just a mistake by Zaslav, and I mean that's a valid thought. Zaslav makes mistakes by the carload lot. But I think Mr. Darcy may be missing the real purpose here. Musk was willing to throw away billions to buy Twitter just to be the king of Dung Mountain and turn the place into a huge contribution in kind to the Trump campaign. If Musk is that dumb or that stoned, why wouldn't he be dumb enough and stoned enough to buy CNN from Zaslav? Can you imagine CNN owned by Elon Musk? The new lineup, CNN Mornings with the team of Elon Musk, and Elon Musk. Then the Midday Musk. Then a phone-in show called Musk-a-Tell. I like that one. Anderson Cooper Tonight with Elon Musk. And of course, The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer with Elon Musk. And of course, every time you click over to CNN, your TV would explode. David, I swear I don't look for these disasters. They choose me, Zaslav. And Elon, I know. We could call CNN Musk CTV. You get it? Must, only with a K, you get it? K instead of T, I'm funny, you will laugh now. K for ketamine, no, forget that part. K for Musk CTV, laugh now, Musk. Today's worst person in the world! one story on the countdown and my favorite topic, me and things I promised not to tell. And here we go again. Rupert Murdoch's, quote, news outlets, unquote, shooting themselves in the groin yet again while they were aiming at me. A little timeline is required on this one. April 1865. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, was assassinated. May 2020, maybe earlier, May 2020 was the earliest I remembered or found. Trump started claiming he had been treated far worse than Abraham Lincoln had. March 16th, 2024, Trump said it again. Then Biden-Harris headquarters tweets the clip, adding, Trump says he's been treated worse than Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated. Also March 16th, 2024, I retweeted that, adding, there's always the hope. March 18th, 2024, Fox News publishes a story first headlined, Keith Olbermann appears to hope for Trump assassination, but the headline was then changed to Keith Olbermann sparks outrage by hinting at Trump assassination with a blue stripe over my face reading, Blue Bloodbath, meaning on some level I am the same as Trump to the New York Post and the Fox News and all the rest of Murdoch's outlets. Well, I was tempted to answer this by saying I was just referring to the auto industry. In reality, obviously, I was and am hoping that Trump will be right and that he will be treated worse than Abraham Lincoln, something worse than assassination, which would be that Trump is convicted and dies in prison. I don't know how many times I have said this. Maybe more than Trump's ludicrous charge that he's been treated worse than Lincoln. I may have actually said it more than he has said that. I think I first said, I hope he dies in prison. I expect he dies in prison in 2016. This is because I hope he dies in prison. But of course, the point of this is Murdoch and Fox, and especially the New York Post, have been doing this to me since about 1996. Always getting it wrong. Ever since I caught the Post in a lie that year about a couple of hockey players that it claimed had been thrown out of a New York City bar for knocking over tables to the horror of customers, when in fact I was with them. And they left the place in their own form of horror because as one of them, Eric Lindros, stood up, he almost knocked over the chair he was sitting in. He said to the other, John LeClaire, I think I've had enough. We got to go home, Johnny. And they politely left, but not before asking if I needed a lift. In 2001, the Post slammed me because I attended a New York Mets game while wearing cargo shorts. A few years later, the Post showed a picture somebody had snapped of me leaning against one of the gates of Central Park here in New York and said I was alone and depressed. Actually, I was alone and early to my dental appointment across the street, and I was trying to talk myself into actually going into my doctor's office. There was a brief interruption in the year during the 2.5 years or so that I worked for Murdoch in sports, a brief interruption in these constantly hilarious stories before Murdoch personally fired me after I had reported with his office's full approval in advance that he was working behind the scenes to sell the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team, which he was. Murdoch later boasted about firing me, but he didn't say that. He didn't boast about it until after he had sold the LA Dodgers baseball team. The origin of the Post's quarter century of badly aimed shots at me stems from that firing. When Murdoch fired me, his minions did it slowly in stages over the course of a couple of days in hopes that they could get me angry and bait me into attacking Fox and News Corp in the newspapers so that then they could fire me for cause. That way they wouldn't owe me the rest of the money on my contract. Instead, as I've mentioned here before, given the choice between waiting 8 months to insult someone and getting a lot of money or getting no money and yelling at them right now, I'll always wait the 8 months. I remained quiet for 8 lovely months, and Rupert had to pay me $100,000 a month to do that. Best job I ever had. So whenever this happens and somebody says, why don't you sue Murdoch or sue News Corp, sue the New York Post, I always say, What kind of money could I get from them that could hurt them more than that $800,000 back in 2001? Also, most of the stuff they do is so hilariously wrong, like the Worse Than Lincoln story, that it's transparently desperate. But twice, they threatened me with stories that I had to take some action about. Once, they completely made one up. And once, they ran a story even though the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security specifically asked them not to run it. The obligatory reminder before I tell you those two stories: you should never believe any source story you read in the New York Post, or indeed on any media outlet owned by the Murdochs, like Fox. They occasionally report real things, but just as often, they make stuff up. Not exaggerate or get slightly wrong or twist, but utterly fabricate. On April 11th, 2005, the New York Post was to run exactly the kind of story I'm talking about. Only under threat of multiple lawsuits did they actually spike it. I hadn't told this story before, but I was reminded of it. I think going through the mechanics of it will illustrate just how evil an organization News Corp actually is, and more importantly, how unreliable it is as a source of news. As a New York Post page 6 gossip story, this one, though, had everything. It attacked MSNBC, it had quotes from informed sources, and even at one point, it had a witness. Now, the witness disappeared during the evolution of this story, but at one point it had a witness. It had somebody prominent insulting Peter Jennings, the newscaster, right after he had revealed he had lung cancer, and it was constructed in such a way that if I did not comment on it, they could print the story, then come back the next day, rehash it, and add that I was still refusing to comment on it. But there was one overriding problem. It was a complete fabrication, and thus it was full of events that didn't happen and people who did not exist. New York Post page 6 contacted MSNBC's then media relations guy Jeremy Gaines on Thursday, April 7th, 2005, with the following story. Keith Olbermann, a, quote, frequent critic of President Bush, had refused to anchor the coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II, pretended to be ill, and called in sick instead. There was, as I suggested earlier, a major problem here. I had anchored the coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II. I had been anchoring the primetime coverage for hours each weeknight, day after day, leading up to the pontiff's passing. There were viewers who had seen me. There were studio staffers. Carl Bernstein was there. He was the in-studio papal expert. He was on the air with me every night for like 6 nights in a row. There were videotapes. Joe Torre, then the manager of the New York Yankees, called me to compliment me on my reverential coverage of the Pope's illness. That did not stop the New York Post. In the first version that page 6 told us it was going to print, their unnamed source had been on board an Amtrak Acela train going from Washington, D.C. to New York, sitting near my agent as my agent talked to somebody on a cell phone. This is apparently a very favorite construction when the New York Post wants to make up a story about somebody. Their witness said my agent complained that I had had a, quote, meltdown after, quote, calling in sick rather than anchoring the papal coverage, which I anchored. But there was more. Quote, Olbermann, a frequent critic of the president's policies, said it was better in sports. They quoted my agent quoting me into the phone. I'll be dealing with this all day now. Apart from the fact that I had anchored the coverage they said I had not anchored, there was another major flaw in this story. My agent was not on a train from Washington to New York on the day in question, or the week in question, or the month, or in fact, the year in question. My agent told me she thought she had once been on a train from Washington to New York in the year 1967. My agent at that time lived atop Mount Shasta in California and so seldom left there that when she once drove to town to get the mail, I asked her for the details of her trip because I jokingly suggested to her we should lead the newscast with it. So, The next day, Friday, April 8th, 2005, New York Post page 6 came back with a different version of this same story. They had misheard their source. Of course, it wasn't my agent on the train from D.C. to New York. It was a woman who worked for my agent, a woman named Susan. A woman named Susan whom they would report, already phoned 3 times that morning. And I was to meet her urgently at the boathouse in Central Park. Presumably because meeting her in the middle of Penn Station when she got off that train would have been a little too public. MSNBC's Jeremy Gaines responded again with some irrefutable refutations. Nobody named Susan worked for my agent. In fact, nobody at all worked for my agent. She was independent. She had a working relationship with a small agency in Los Angeles, and basically they covered her phone calls when she was on vacation, which she almost never was because she never left the top of Mount effing Shasta. We called that agency, and they confirmed that not only did they not have anybody working for them named Susan, but nobody from that agency was even on the East Coast, or had been, so far that entire year. At this point, I called the television columnist of the New York Post and off the record explained to him that I was kind of furious, and this time I was actually going to sue, but that NBC was far angrier than I was, and that they were going to sue as well, and sue the editor of Page 6 personally. I calmly went through the facts of this. This guy, the TV guy, had a conscience. He sighed. He said he got those kind of calls more often than I would believe, and I said, no, I believe it. And he said he would go to the editor of Page 6 and explain somebody was lying to him, the editor, and he was going to get himself sued into bankruptcy over a really obviously untrue and completely disproved story. Okay, so now a couple hours later, New York Post Page 6 calls again, demanding a comment from me on the third different version of their exhaustive papal scoop. No, the woman their witness heard, who they first said was my agent, then said she had gotten it wrong. It was a woman named Susan who worked for my agent. She had now become a woman who worked for my agent, whose name the witness never heard, but she was talking to somebody else named Susan. And there was an additional quote now thrown in. I'll be dealing this all day now, had morphed into, I'll be dealing with this all day now. The same week Peter Jennings makes his announcement about having lung cancer, this idiot, a frequent critic of President Bush, is sitting around in his pajamas calling me about this. I'll spare you how I know this was not true. It has something to do with the fact that I don't wear pajamas. Years later, a former gossip reporter in Murdoch's employ explained to me that his celebrity and gossip people are taught never to back down from a confrontation, and that if the subject of one of their hit jobs fires back or tries to refute or especially threatens legal action, to keep making the story worse and worse for them. And in the first decade of this century anyway, you were supposed to try to work in a defense of George W. Bush. But there's also what she said they called an emergency exit. If there is no question that the story is nonsensical, if the basic spine of the story does not line up with provable facts, just abandon it. Abandon it. Don't tell the subject of your attack that you are abandoning it. Just don't make any more phone calls. Don't send any more emails about it. Just vanish. Just disappear the story. And then send the name of the subject of the story that you've just punted. Send it around to all the other Murdoch operations to see if they can come up with any dirt on the subject to punish them for fighting back against Rupert Murdoch's lies. So they abandoned the story, and it took the New York Post a year and a half to get me back, and to get back the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. On September 26, 2006, I opened an envelope bearing a California postmark at my home in New York. I shouldn't have done it, but bluntly, I'll confess to this. I thought it was some baseball cards I had bought off eBay. Well, it wasn't. The envelope contained a sticky substance, looked like Drano mixed with talcum powder, and it fell out. An accompanying note said it was anthrax, and now I and other liberals would get a taste of our own medicine. even reading those chilling words and having covered the actual anthrax letters, terrorist attacks of 2001 when I was with CNN, I knew it wasn't anthrax. The guy who supposedly sent the actual anthrax in 2001 was an expert in the field, and even he mishandled the stuff so badly that supposedly he gave himself anthrax and died of it. On the other hand, I know the odds were impossible, but what if I was wrong? My apartment building was filled with little old ladies who had lived there since Roosevelt was president. I only assumed that meant Franklin, not Theodore. The odds were, 1 in a billion that it was anthrax. But who was I to dismiss this 1 in a billion chance that these little old ladies were going to get anthrax? Who was I to make that call? So instead I made a call. I called the FBI. Well, it was quite an evening. The cops showed up. The FBI showed up. They said, of course, it's not anthrax, but we have to act like it is. Welcome to our new world. The hazmat squad came in. They set up a command post in the building. They swept my apartment. They said, okay, now you have to go to the emergency room for tests. And I said, it's not anthrax. You just said so. And they said, if we have to do this, you have to do this too. I laughed. Plus, if you don't, we can arrest you as a threat to public health, and we can make you go to the hospital. So out I went into an ambulance, dressed in a hazmat suit, one size too small, that really cut in the groin. I spent the night getting checked out. The FBI then called and said, it's like Drano with ivory soap flakes. But they also said there had been other letters that had arrived that night and the night before, sent to people like the chairman of CBS and David Letterman's office and Nancy Pelosi and some poor guy who happened to have the name Jon Stewart, who was not the Jon Stewart. And they couldn't make me do this, but it would really help if I did not report what happened on my TV show that night, just for the one day. Do it tomorrow, because they had a lead on the guy who had sent all these letters, and they didn't want to scare him off. And I said, sure, I'm a patriot. The next day, while we were still observing the embargo on the story, my story, planning to run it at 8 o'clock at night, New York Post, page 6, led with a picture of me with the headline, Powder Puff Spooks Keith, and making sure to identify me as, quote, a frequent critic of President Bush's policies. The New York Post mocked me for not just assuming it was fake anthrax and ignoring it, and claimed I insisted the cops should take me to the hospital. Quote, whether they gave him a lollipop on the way out isn't known. By the way, one of the actual anthrax letters in 2001, one of the letters with actual anthrax in it that got some people sick and killed a little old lady, had been mailed to the New York Post, and one of their staffers had contracted anthrax, and still this was their attitude towards anthrax threats. Anyway, as it turned out, there was a guy in California sending out these threatening letters, each with fake anthrax, to about a dozen people. He sent me 4 of them ultimately. I soon knew the FBI guys by their first names. I pointed out to FBI Doug that the last envelope I received had a barcode on it. Maybe they could track the guy that way. And he said, oh, you're right. And the next thing I knew, the FBI had just videotaped the suspect mailing yet another letter to me, the 5th, from his home in Woodland Hills, California. And I swear to God, he actually lived in his mother's basement at age 37 or something. And FBI Doug said, do we have your permission to pull a letter out of the mailbox and open it? And I said, sure. And the next thing I knew, the guy was sentenced to prison for like 18 months. But not before FBI Doug said, by the way, that barcode you noticed, it connected to the post office here. And that's where we found his address. And we also found the fact that he purchased a postal money order for $15 made out to the Catherine Harris for Florida Senate campaign, if you remember her from Gore v. Bush. And his online history, we looked that all up. It's all about how she, Catherine Harris, and some woman named Laura something or another, they are the most beautiful women in history. And I said, Laura, Laura Ingraham? And FBI Doug said, yeah, that's it, Laura Ingraham. And if that isn't 10 years of my life in one sentence, courtesy of the New York effing Post, I don't know what is. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. We're now back to 5 episodes a week, posting nightly just after midnight Eastern. Follow me for the podcast promo videos on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, X, Instagram, and TubeFace. And once again, there is a Monday countdown, at least through the election. Whatever happens after that. Please send this podcast to somebody who does not know they need to listen, but they should. We have a new addition to the staff. Kit has joined us. In fact, Kit and Ted sat through these last 2 segments. Ted is already asleep, and Kit, who is 4 months old, is looking up at me quizzically like, what the hell are you talking about? As often, Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, the musical directors of Countdown, have looked at me. They have arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Chanel handling orchestration and keyboards. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by the best baseball stadium organist ever, Nancy Faust. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Other music arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. My announcer today was my friend Dennis Leary, and everything else was, as usual, pretty much my fault. So that's Countdown for today, 2 weeks and 5 days until the 2024 presidential election, the 1,381st day since convicted felon dissociative fugue J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the election, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity to keep him from doing it again while we still have a chance to do so. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news requires. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.